We'll go ahead and get started on this edition of the C-Band Lunch and Learn webinar series. I'm Curtis Dean. I'm one of the co-founders for the Community Broadband Action Network. We've got a really interesting topic to talk about today, and that's the role of rural electric cooperatives in building out fiber networks to rural areas. And we've got a couple of great guests, and myself and my compatriot Todd Kilcoff will be leading you through that discussion. We'll get that underway in just a second. I did want to talk a little bit about, whoops, that's a sneak preview. I wanted to talk a little thank you for our C-Band vendor members. These are the companies that have joined as members of the Community Broadband Action Network, and the dues that they pay are helping support the activities such as this webinar and other activities, hopefully in-person activities at some point in the future. And we really want to thank all our C-Band vendor members for stepping up to the plate and participating. If you're on the line and you are representing a community, or you are representing a broadband provider that is community-based, or you're just somebody who is an advocate for community broadband, really like to see you join as a C-Band member. Membership is free for communities, for advocates, and for providers. Vendors do pay the fees that help put this stuff on. But if you are one of those other advocates, communities, or providers and would like to become part of our discussion, we'd welcome you to join C-Band by going to our website at broadbandaction.com. Also, we want to preview our next Lunch and Learn, which is next month. That says September, but no, it's not September. It's August 18th of 2020. At noon. It is going to be Accessible, Affordable Internet for All Act, which is recently passed the U.S. House of Representatives on its way to the Senate. One of the architects of that bill is Representative Cindy Axne of Iowa. And if you see that link down there below, you can jot that down. That will be the registration link. We'll come back on this slide at the end and leave it up for a couple of minutes. I might even correct it while we're talking here so that it has the correct date on it. But this is our next Lunch and Learn. Again, it is actually August 18th, 2020 at noon. So we appreciate any of you that want to get registered for that. Again, I'll come back to this slide at the end of our discussion. I'd like to introduce our panelists today and my co-presenter, co-founder, Todd Kilcoff. First of all, Steve Collier is with Conexon, and he is going to talk a little bit about his firm here in just a minute and give you a little background on what he has done and why he is on this panel and is talking about rural electric cooperatives. The other person you see, our other panelist, is a familiar face to community broadband people all over the nation. Christopher Mitchell is with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and he is going to be talking about some of the research and studies that they've done on the role of community broadband by RECs, and especially in helping solve the problems for reaching more rural Americans with broadband services. So thank you everybody for coming on board. We appreciate you all being here. Todd Kilcoff is joining me here. Todd is one of the co-founders of C-Band, along with yours truly. So I'm going to just get things started with you, Chris, if I could. You know, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance is one of the, by far one of the most important advocacy organizations in the nation, but you do a lot of research too to try to study trends and what's going on in broadband development across the nation. Tell us a little bit about what you have learned at ISLR about the work being done to improve broadband by rural electric cooperatives.
Curtis, you didn't write ILSR large enough.
Did I do it again?
Yes.
See, those are the initials, and I always get them wrong, right? ILSR.
That's okay.
I'm just going to say the Institute from now on.
That's what I do, actually.
My dyslexia is showing again.
Yes, we do research on it, on what basically local governments are doing around broadband, what communities are doing around broadband especially. And one of the things that we've seen is just a proliferation of very high quality networks being built by electric cooperatives. And actually produced a map. We've been trying to track this. We have issued a report that we call Cooperatives Fiberize Rural America, a trusted model for, I think it's internetification, because I just wanted to invent as many words as possible for people who like that sort of a thing.
Better than gentrification.
Yes, exactly. It's sort of, it's in some ways it is definitely improving rural areas quite a bit with this access. And one of the things that we've tried to do is not just to show where we're seeing rural cooperative networks, which includes both telephone cooperatives, which in many cases got an earlier start, but also the electric cooperatives, and where electric cooperatives have gotten really ambitious. Um, the We've seen many electric cooperatives commit to bringing fiber to everyone within their footprint. Not all of them have the financing laid out, but they've all committed to it. Many of them are hoping to be supported through federal programs that are subsidizing rural access. The electric cooperatives appear to be the lowest cost way of expanding the highest quality broadband in many parts of the country, in my opinion. And this isn't just related to, I would say, the fact that they have telephone poles, utility poles, actually. Because in a number of cases, they're building underground.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of places in which it's a heck of a lot easier to just throw a trench to a ditch switch and pull, do direct bury, I guess, in many cases, rather than trying to attach to every pole, especially in parts of the middle of the country where we have ice storms and things like that. So we have a report, and if I can just share my screen quick I can't. Host has disabled it. But if you go to muninetworks.org, you'll be able to find our report, Cooperatives Fiberize Rural America, or even easier, just throw it right into a search engine on the internet. And if it's doing its job, you'll come right to that report. It has maps of what we're seeing across the US. And I guess the thing that, Curtis, you are muted.
I was just saying you're now a co-host if you want to share that.
All right. Well, then I can abuse that too, perhaps.
Please do.
Here we go. So this is a map that you can see in greater detail if you download the report. But you see, these are the telephone cooperatives. A lot of North Dakota and South Dakota are just overwhelming with where we see the telephone cooperatives. In the purple, you see the electric cooperatives. And it's important to note, the lighter purple then is where they've committed to build out. And this, as Steve would be perhaps not able to fully share with us, the inside information I get from companies like Conexon is that basically all of rural Missouri, Arkansas, significant swaths of some of these other states are in actuality going to be built out by these electric cooperatives. So there's even more than we have here, and we'll see more as over the next year as the auction from the FCC funds comes in. But the point is, there's a ton of cooperative fiber out there. The telephone cooperatives have been doing it for 20 years in some cases. The electric cooperatives just got started about 10 years ago with fiber. And over the past few years is when we've really ramped it up. We've gone from about 50, maybe 2 years ago, to well over 100 today. I think there's a decent chance we'll have more than 150 that are committed to fiber by the end of the year. And these are entities that provide service to like half of these states, these 48 states. So they're responsible for a shocking amount of territory. And this is how I think a lot of rural America will ultimately be connected.
Great. There is a lot of area that's already filled in, as you see there, and a lot more coming. I did want to just point out, where some of our members are in Iowa, and when you look at the map of Iowa, where fiber to the home is, almost all of that territory is actually served by local, either electric cooperative or telephone cooperative. Very few of the cities have it, and the ones that do are mostly served by municipalities. So.
Yes, and I think it's important. I mean, we're going to talk about electric cooperatives, and I think there's a lot of reasons to be particularly excited about electric cooperatives. Some of that is just taking the telephone cooperatives for granted because some of them have been doing this work so well for so long. I think it's important to notice that they've done a really good job, but I also think the electric cooperatives will make a bigger difference over time because I think they're going to be more aggressive in terms of trying to connect everyone. They have larger service territories in many cases. And so I want to respect what the telephone cooperatives have done, but I think electric cooperatives, it's like this building wave that's just going to take things over in rural America.
Well, and like you said, rural telephone cooperatives have already filled a lot of their service territories in, and they're either going to grow outside of that, or the RECs are going to serve a lot of that rural areas. So bring in our other panelist here, Steve Collier with Conexon. And Steve wants to talk just a little bit about what you do at Conexon, what Conexon does, and how you got to where you are today in your role there at Conexon.
Sure. Well, I'm a lifelong electric utility person. Started out even in college in a cooperative education program as a student engineer at Houston Lighting and Power Company. I left there and went a number of places, worked in the solar business at Sandia Labs, been a partner in a consulting firm, have been the executive vice president of an electric co-op, have tended to work with electric co-ops and municipals more than any other client or customer. I've been both a vendor and a consultant and an employee. I joined Conexon last fall. Conexon was founded by an old friend of mine, Randy Clint, who was the head of the IT at a little co-op called Como in central Missouri. Mm-hmm. And they decided that they would extend fiber to the premises, that in their view, fiber was getting to be just as important as having electricity, and their members didn't have it. And so they built out, had some public funding that helped a little bit, not a lot. They financed an awful lot of that because they thought it was so important. A neighboring co-op in Arkansas, Ozarks Electric Co-op in Fayetteville, recruited Randy, said, "We want you to come and do the same thing for us." And so they did that at Ozarks. And in the process, Randy became familiar with Jonathan Chambers at the FCC. And Jonathan and Randy banded together just a few years ago and formed Conexon. And what we do is work exclusively with electric co-ops. We'd love to work across the board, but not all electric co-ops get along with rural telcos or municipals. And so we try to avoid those conflicts simply by working with electric co-ops. We have about 200 clients. We have about a little over 20 that are building out at the current time. We have a very large consortium that we've organized to bid on this upcoming RDOF funding auction, the Rural Development Opportunity Fund. We've had good luck in the past with the Connect America Fund, getting financing. These co-ops have the same challenge that they had when there wasn't any electricity in rural areas. It was too expensive. And so the federal government in the 1930s formed the Rural Electrification Administration and did two things. One, made low interest loans available. And the second thing they did was form the Rural Electrification Administration to help co-ops, help them with engineering, help them with management, et cetera. And so we work with these co-ops, help them as much as we can to get funding. We do the feasibility study. We have an advantage, as Chris mentioned, with electric co-ops. They already have poles and wires, or they already have conduit. Mm-hmm. And then in the fiber business, we call that building out in the power space. That if you've already got poles or you've already got conduit, it's a lot cheaper to extend fiber than if you have to do a greenfield and start from scratch. And so we have helped, as I mentioned, about 20-something co-ops that are in the process of building out. It's a multi-year process. Como just recently connected their 20,000th subscriber, wow, which is a major threshold. You have to understand about electric co-ops. They are very sparsely populated. The average electric cooperative has 7 customers in a mile of line. Mm. And the median is well below the mean. In other words, the average is well below the midpoint. Half of the co-ops, more than half of the co-ops are less than 7 customers per mile of line. So if they don't have some kind of advantage, some kind of help, it's very difficult. So the federal government has recognized, and the pandemic has really put an exclamation point behind this, that it's just as important to rural school students, rural healthcare providers, just as important to have broadband internet as it is to have electricity. And so the federal government has been very active. Some state governments have been very active. We've had the CAF, we've had the RDOF, we have the CARES Act, which we are helping some of our clients get organized to take advantage of that. And the reason I joined Conexon any of you who have ever heard of me know me as the smart grid man. I've done a lot of consulting, do a lot of social media, and we believe that, and many of our co-op clients believe that they're going to have to operate a smart grid. That involves real-time monitoring and control of not just the wires, but everything that's connected to the wires: electric vehicles, rooftop solar arrays, smart generation at industrial commercial customers. And so we believe that an important value of a fiber network, which may not be able to say it's worth this much dollars, but rather you're going to have it. You can't operate an electric co-op without wires. You have to have wires to deliver electricity. We're beginning to understand that we're going to have smarts to operate a grid where there's power coming into the grid from the customers, not just going out of the grid to the customers. So we kind of took a page out of one of my favorite examples of public internet, the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Their electric power board years ago, my friend Harold DePriest was CEO at the time, they decided that they needed to reinvigorate the city, and they would do it by extending gigahertz broadband to everyone in the city of Chattanooga. I help co-ops extend broadband, and our co-ops have broadband members. I still am served by one of the big investor-owned telcos. I get allegedly 50 megabits per second. It's never that fast. My daughters are constantly complaining about the speed, but we believe that having the fiber network in an electric utility will eventually be as important for operating a smart grid as it is for extending the benefits of broadband fiber communications to their members.
So sounds like there's a real economic return beyond just the fees that an REC can collect from selling services. There's another economic return, which is making your electric grid more efficient.
Yeah, and you can look at it two ways. One is to try to quantify, so what is the smart grid worth in dollars? And there are benefits. If you're more efficient and you have lower losses, and perhaps you can sell some additional services. But my primary view about this is we're at a point in the electric utility industry because of what we call distributed energy resources: electric vehicles, rooftop solar arrays, backup generation, power wall batteries. We're in a mode now where there's more stuff happening on the customer side of the meter than is happening on the utility side of the meter. And just like you have to have wires to deliver electricity, we believe that you're going to have smart grid capabilities to continue to deliver that electricity successfully.
And
if I could just jump in, go ahead, Todd, I'll go after you.
That gets down to having bilateral communications in real time, because most people don't understand that the electric grid is being operated in real time, or instead of, I just flip it on. Given my electric background, I know that that's the real bugaboo is, and that's just not real-time flowing of pricing information, which may happen, but also just about the power flow itself, because heat is the world's enemy of loss, and if we want to have a greener world, it's eliminating wasted heat.
Yeah. And it's not just the monitoring, it's also the control. And one of the key elements there is a thing that we call latency, which is how long it takes when the utility sends a signal out to control something before it gets that signal and does the control. And one of the advantages of a broadband network is low latency. So if you're needing to switch a bunch of electric vehicles on and off remotely quickly, if you're wanting to operate a switch or a recloser or a transformer tap changer, having the ability to do that fast, fiber fast, we believe is essential. And that's really been my role as I joined Conexon to begin to try to advance that level of options for our clients. We help them do the feasibility, we help them design, we help them build, we help them operate. We want to help them be smart grids.
I wanted to, I just want to note, Harold DePriest really is a visionary on this. I was glad to hear his name. I did an extended podcast with him several years ago, in which we talked about all the things that I think are relevant for this audience, not just about electricity, but how he positioned the utility to move from being just an electric utility to moving into a space in which they would have to compete for customers on the broadband service. And I continue to think that people have really neglected that part of the Chattanooga story, which is possibly the most important, which is the work that the utility did to get out of a monopoly mindset and into a competitive mindset.
Right. You know, you had a situation where you had Nashville, they've got music, you had Memphis, they had Elvis, you had Oak Ridge, they had science, and Chattanooga had been this industrial city and had kind of fallen into disrepair. That industry had moved away, and the city fathers were, with Harold's help, very visionary that we have got to do something to rejoin a competitive municipal government market, and we think the way to do that is fiber. And that you can actually get gigahertz fiber, 3 gigahertz fiber service in Chattanooga for less than I pay AT&T for 50 megabit service. And it has revolutionized Chattanooga.
And you could tell that you're an electric guy because you keep misspeaking and saying gigahertz rather than gigabits, but we all know what you're talking about.
Exactly.
The other issue is that most people don't realize about their electric utility is that there's just a large amount of existing infrastructure that has a 25-year life to it. And what I think rural America, and particularly policymakers, are figuring out is they're listening to the message that those assets are being spread over fewer and fewer people. And if we don't invest in the information economy, then the largest part about your investment in livability is being wasted. And so then the investment you need to make on the information side is about growing that economy just a little bit more. But stability is a win, and it's a win all across the board. And so I think you're going to keep seeing that investment being made because it's good for the electric customer. You know, as a long-term economic base.
Yeah, I could tell you my IOU, we had a couple weeks ago, we had some problems with some unreliability in which I discovered my UPS battery had not kept up, and I may have lost a hard drive on a network attached storage device. And so fortunately, I'm robust enough that I haven't lost any data. But just to give you a sense, I mean, like anyone who is, when you have power unreliability today, that can mean actual significant losses to businesses who don't appreciate that. And they take this into consideration if they're going to build significant investments. Businesses aren't going to go to places where they can't get reliable electricity. So for Chattanooga, I mean, and for any electric utility, as Todd's mentioning, the ability to provide high quality power is really linked to economic development. And that's the point that I wanted to make that with Todd, is that for a number of electric utilities, I think they're getting in this not necessarily because they're excited about broadband or even because you know, they feel that broadband is essential. They're doing broadband because they view it as essential for their electric side.
Right.
Because if their population continues to shrink, their electric side will have an existential crisis. And so I just want to put a point on what Todd said, because it's not just about, you know, sort of be nice to have more people. It's actually an existential threat to the utility if the electric demand declines too much over a period of time.
Well, the other thing that's happening is that the electric utility industry is being turned upside down. For 100 years, starting with Thomas Edison, we had this perfect model. Costs were going down, sales were going up, and reliability was acceptable. Today, costs are going up, sales are going down, and reliability is terrible. And in part because the grid is old, in part because the grid is being challenged with, you don't just turn on a coal-fired generator, you don't just turn on a nuclear power plant. You've got wind generators. In Texas, we have hundreds of megawatts of wind generation. Guess when that generation runs? You don't turn it on when you need it. You trust God to let the wind blow when you need it. And so you have this stochastic kind of view where we used to control everything. Now we really don't control anything. And all the action is happening out there on the customer side of the meter. That's where the generation is being built. That's where the batteries are. That's where all the complexity is. And so you go in this country, we have 20,000 electric generating units operated by electric utilities, 20,000. We have 75,000 transmission substations. We used to think that was the most huge and complex machine that men had ever built. Today, we have 1.5 million rooftop solar arrays. We have over 1 million electric vehicles. We have 500,000 batteries. We have 150 million smart thermostats. Makes that grid that we thought was so complex look like tinker toys compared to where we are today. And the kind of communications and control that a utility has to have to operate in that environment is totally different than it's been in the past. SCADA isn't good enough. You got to move out to the edges with that monitoring and control.
I also think it's interesting that at least what I'm seeing is on the co-op side from a business case, the distributed generation having at the farm level, who's the ratepayer, and that ratepayer wants a smart farm and smart energy.
Yes.
So now I think it's become much more easier for boards at the co-op level to make the investment of going into debt that maybe they didn't want, because they're being told by their customers that I need both and this is why. And once it becomes a value proposition to have a smart farm and a smart grid, now you have allies instead of getting fought for rate increases, or all of a sudden now you have allies to, well, if we need to chip in a little or we need to back the debt, that's a worthwhile investment. We've seen that in Iowa, where the Farm Bureau has really had to maybe make broadband not a government involvement issue, but at what level is it just needed in partnerships or whatever with the co-ops, and the municipalities have the scale to make our members happy.
And it is possible for an electric co-op to extend fiber in a manner that does not cause them to have to raise rates to their consumers.
Right.
That they examine that feasibility. That's a hard sell to get a co-op to do fiber if they're going to have to raise rates.
Right.
And actually,
if they can get beneficial financing, if they can get some grants, they get revenue from providing internet services. If they can get some value from smart grid, then they can do this without having to raise rates, because that's the one thing they don't want to do.
and this is a tremendous long-term value proposition that, if I overstate, I'll trust the three of you to rein me back in. But let me just give you the really positive state case for this from a rural electric point of view. And that's that right now you're going to try and make a business case work, and you're going to hope for 60-70% take rate. I mean, maybe you're trying to make the business case work on 40 or 50%, but really you're thinking 2 out of 3 people signs up, we're going to do well. Well, over 10 years, I think most of us are expecting 9 out of 10 people to sign up, or 10 out of 10 people to sign up.
Yes.
And that means you have tremendous revenue growth potential for the margins that you'll never get on electricity to put the cooperative into a really strong space. And so not only that, but in most of the country, we're expecting to see more broadband competition. And right now WISPs are really active in rural America. And again, I don't want to say anything negative about them. I don't want to to be perceived as attacking them. But I think the case for WISPs is going to be much stronger in cities and suburban areas, where they can also spread their fixed costs more thinly. I think fiber will take over rural areas, and I do not think you're going to see someone that says, I'm going to come in and compete in a rural area with this fiber broadband rural electric provider. So, I mean, in effect, they're not going to have a legal guarantee of a monopoly, but if they do it well, they're going to have a monopoly that will more than pay for itself, and they'll be more or less insulated as long as they do a good job from competition. So this is, I mean, it might look like a difficult business case over the next 5 years, but for the 15 years after that, it's an amazing business case.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and we have some pretty interesting anecdotes. I'm working with an electric co-op in Minnesota. They have a neighboring telco. The electric co-op has some large farms, some large commercial accounts that don't have broadband internet. They haven't been reached. They're reluctant to compete with the telco. And what we're talking about is that the telco, either the electric builds the fiber and leases it to the telco, or the telco actually builds the fiber out. They get a joint use agreement and build the fiber out in the power space on the electric co-op. Mm. So I think, Chris, in addition to what you're talking about, I think we're going to see a foundation for some cooperation, which we have not had very much in the past, between municipal governments, telcos, and electrics, because in some ways the internet is more important than electricity. I'll tell you a funny story about that. At my house, I'm served by a municipal electric utility, and we're at the edges. So when there's a storm, the power goes out. When the electricity goes out at my house, guess the complaint I get from my wife and 3 daughters?
Internet's out.
There's no internet.
Yeah.
We got to have internet. I say, well, girls, if we don't have electricity, we don't have internet. That they don't want to hear that. That's not what they think about. And if you gave them a choice, if I said, okay, girls, here you're going to have to choose. Do you want electricity or do you want internet? And electricity is air conditioning and cold milk. Which would you choose? They'll choose internet. I mean, this is a different world that we live in.
Yeah, no, I've heard that from Washington State, and we're not talking about just millennials here, where the Chelan fires that took out a whole bunch of electric transmission and fiber optics for broadband. When they went to talk to those customers that are quite isolated, those people said, well, they went to them and said, "We're going to get your electricity back as fast as possible. It's going to be 2 or 3 weeks." And they were shocked at how many people said, "Oh, just don't worry about the electricity. When can you get my internet back?" And that's because it's a lifeline for people. We don't appreciate, especially those of us who are used to being in cities. Humans are social creatures, and the internet is finally actually being able to meet that. And I think it's more important that we have this high quality access in rural areas than anywhere else because of that.
And even in the city, at my house during the pandemic, guess how we get our groceries? We go online, and we either get them delivered or we do curbside pickup, but the whole thing that we do is all online.
I'm always fascinated by, and we've talked a little bit about it here today, some of the parallels between electrification and fiberification, if we want to use another new word to make up. And it just goes so deep. And one of those parallels is the federal government playing a role in trying to speed deployment. You mentioned the Rural Electrification Association and the role it played. Now we have programs such as RDOF and others that are potentially coming. Is it all about the money that is going to make this happen, or are there other forms of assistance that our state and federal governments can help to help RECs with their fiberification?
Well, it is an economic challenge in the same way that it was a challenge in the 30s. You know, people were driving into town with a battery and taking it back out to the farm so they would have a radio. You know, it was just too darned expensive. You could not get an acceptable rate of return that would enable a banker to say, yeah, we're going to lend you that money, and there's enough debt service coverage that we're confident that you'll be able to pay it back. It required subsidies. That's the way we got electricity in rural areas, and it's the way we've gotten lots of services and products in the world in the last century. That's what the government is there for, to help things happen that need to happen that don't happen on their own. So there is a financial challenge, and without some financial help, there are some electric co-ops out there that are little by little extending fiber. I have a neighbor to the south of me here, a Guadalupe Valley Electric Cooperative, and Darren Schauer and his staff are gradually extending fiber out to the edges. It'll take them years to get that finished, but they believe it is so important in their area that they're willing to take that on, but they have to do it slowly because it's an economic challenge.
And if I could just note that I think for a lot of people, myself included, I think there's a fear of how much is this going to cost, especially anyone who knows how USF works, the Universal Service Fund, with the contribution factor, which is out of control. And I think the good news is that the electric co-ops are the model of how to finance something correctly. The electric co-ops is one of the best government investments of all time, and that it subsidized the capital costs up front. It was a one-time subsidy. The networks are sustainable on the revenues they generate. And that's what we're seeing on the broadband side too, is that these co-ops that are building out this fiber for the electric, they don't need a per month subsidy to be able to keep operating it. They're able to keep it going just on the revenues it creates. That's really important. So I think it's a note to reassure people who might be worried about the cost of this. You know, even if we're looking at tens of billions of dollars of one-time costs over several years, that is totally reasonable relative to the value that will be created.
Yes.
But one other thing I wanted to note, Curtis, is that next month you're having on August 18th, not September 19th.
I changed the slide. We'll come
Okay.
back.
The Accessible, Affordable Internet for All Act, I'm really excited. I mean, we just, I reviewed that a little bit to get a sense of what Democrats were thinking in the House. That will get rid of all the barriers in the states against community networks and
Right.
cooperatives. Now, it's important to note, I mean, many people are familiar, states have the authority to create hurdles for municipal networks, and more or less federal law allows for that. Federal law does not allow states to create barriers to the electric co-ops, but they have anyway. And the electric co-ops have generally not wanted to challenge them. So Kentucky and Nebraska in particular, we've seen less investment from electric co-ops because they just haven't wanted to go through with a lawsuit that they would invariably win.
Right.
And so that discussion, and then just I think it was today even, Biden and Sanders released a joint committee statement about economic plans for a Biden administration, and one of their top priorities again is removing those sorts of barriers to the co-ops and the munis.
Yeah.
So I think we're seeing a lot more recognition that the federal government needs to be more active in clearing these barriers out of the way, rather than just sitting back and letting individual co-ops challenge them where they exist.
Yeah, good point.
One of the
Interesting, the Rural Electrification Administration, those loans, it wasn't grants.
Mhm.
What they borrowed money at a lower interest rate than if you went to the bank. Those co-ops paid all that money back. I mean, so it was a subsidy, but it was a marginal subsidy. It wasn't shovelfuls of cash to do with as you wanted.
part of what's in this bill, Curtis and I were actually fortunate enough to be able to comment early on the bill as it was being drafted. And one of the things that is in the bill that I'm excited about is the ability to get credit enhancement on the working capital pieces, which is a risk reduction for the lender, as opposed to you having to use the federal money to actually buy equipment that maybe you don't want.
Right.
Maybe you just put something in the ground. There's also should be, and don't know if it made the final bill, credit for recent investments that you've already made. Mm-hmm. So if you're extending a network, you can use that as local match because that is building your rate base and reducing risk to the lender. So hopefully some of these things stay in, but I'm with Chris that there's some neat features in there for partnerships. And there's also neat features in there for removing barriers that are non-traditional barriers besides just here, we'll lend you the money and you can just be the conduit.
Yeah.
Yeah, some states like I think Kentucky, or I think Tennessee, and there's been a fight in Louisiana recently. I think this is resolved where electric co-ops might have authority to build only in their historic territories.
Right.
They're not allowed to leave them, and that's one of the issues that will have to be resolved here because, I think even if electrics cover all of their own territories, they are going to have to spread out a bit, whether that's in areas that we would consider to be urban. People have different definitions of what that means, but even people that have cable monopolies, they want a better service. And I think electric co-ops can provide that where they choose to.
A couple of points from our question, people on the attendees. Comment from Robert: the nationwide lockdown proved to stress the bandwidth of our current networks in place and would lean toward overbuilding in the cities as well as building out in the rural areas. Brings up something maybe Chris or Steve could address. Are we seeing RECs not only build in the areas they serve with electric now, or are they also going into communities that are maybe nearby their electric service territories that are suffering from the duopoly problem we have now with big cable and big phone?
Yeah, we're seeing cooperatives make different decisions about that. I think Como, the one that Randy Clinton had got them started on the fiber, I think they're building into the suburbs around Jefferson City now, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah. So we're definitely seeing that. I mean, there's a big fight in that some of the telephone cooperatives and other telephone companies have been lobbying Congress to try to stop any smart grid money going to an electric co-op to support its activities outside of its area. With the idea being that if you make it easier for an electric co-op to build to one area, and then they then extend it on their own time to another area that has service already, that should somehow be blocked.
Yeah.
And I think I can appreciate, anyone trying to get an advantage. I mean, that's the nature of our system. Everyone gets the right to make the case that they want, but I think we should be on guard for anything that makes it harder to build out these networks to create more competition.
Well, and the motivation for co-ops, Curtis, has never been primarily financial. It has been social. And so they don't feel a lot of pressure to extend beyond their normal service area unless there's a severe need. In other words, there's an area in which they're just not going to get served, and if we do it, we can serve them. But they tend to follow their wires, and the wires, they don't often extend beyond those wires. They each have a board of directors, and their board of directors and the city council, they're all elected officials, and sometimes they like to fight, but they would rather not fight. And so they're pretty politically astute.
And that's certainly the case with municipalities that have built, that had an electric utility and built telecommunications. They tend to serve the same area where they serve with their electric facilities, because that's their mission. And their mission is not necessarily to extend service 5 miles out of town. And in fact, that's the law in some places. So. It's
really interesting, though, when an electric co-op like Como extends fiber or GVEC, they are swamped with the neighbors saying, "Ooh, us too, please, our neighborhood."
Oh, and can I get your electricity too? Could you do that? Well,
yeah.
Another comment from Dave. USDA RUS is revolving loan fund. The same could be done for electrics getting into broadband. Have some of the electric cooperatives utilized the RUS to get funding for build outs?
I am not familiar with any co-ops that have borrowed money specifically to extend fiber or to extend other broadband. I think that the RUS has had some programs for that, but it's not generally available like borrowing to extend electric service.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is interest rates are so low right now. The incentive to deal with paperwork from the federal government is not so great when you could get a loan from CoBank or from other sources. I also think that there's a lot of us like the idea of revolving loans because they can be low interest, it's elegant. At the same time, from a perspective of how many people you employ in a government agency to oversee a grant program versus a revolving loan program, it's lower cost to do grant programs because you do the due diligence up front and then you get the money out the door, and then there's some manner of checking in, but it's not as significant as a loan. So loan programs can just be more complicated to administer, and that's one of the reasons I think we see more states doing matching grant programs rather than loan programs.
One question I have for any of you here is that we've talked about that, some of the RECs that have extended fiber to their electric customers have done so because the REC and their board, their governing body, their leadership made a decision that that was the best long-term thing to do, not only for their electric utility, but to serve the people that they cover. Have there been many instances where that decision has come from the grassroots? In other words, where electric ratepayers have been the one coming to the board meeting saying, "Hey, why aren't you doing this? You need to do this. I know you don't care about smart grid, but dang it, we need better internet." Are you seeing any of that?
Yeah.
I'll tell you where it happens frequently.
Okay.
Is the neighboring co-op. A co-op is extending fiber to the premises. The members of the neighboring co-op get excited and say, "Hey, could we do this too?" That's the most frequent episode where that occurs. I'm not really familiar with a co-op who has entered into extending fiber simply because their electric customers came to them and said, "We want fiber." It's more, or broadband. I keep using fiber, but because we're a fiber company, but broadband, I'm sure that's happened in some places, but I'm not directly familiar with them.
Just last month it did. I'm about to put a link in the chat for DMEA, which actually is not the one so there's two examples I can talk about. One is Delta Montrose Electric
Right.
Association.
Colorado.
Yeah, the Western Slope, and they have significant fiber assets through hard to reach areas, and the communities were planning on building their own network, and they asked the co-op to make it easy on them by leasing some fibers on some paths, and the co-op said, we don't even want to get involved with anything around broadband, nothing whatsoever. And so I think it was like 90 or 100 businesses came to the next meeting and said, hey, you might not want to do it, but your new board members do.
Wow.
And intimidated the hell out of them. Switched, I think, 2 board members. I did an interview with people who did the organizing effort, and that co-op is now building out fiber to all of its territory, I believe, which is like, 4 or 5 Western counties. So it's a big territory.
Yeah.
Then just last month, this is actually a Conexon. John had done one of his many, I'm sure, feasibility studies for New Hampshire Electric Co-op.
Yes.
And they thought about it and decided it wasn't right for them. The manager in particular was just very nervous about it. And there was a movement among the membership to have a vote. And in order for the membership to vote over the wishes of the management, they had to get 2/3 majority, and they got 64%. In the election. I think it was 64 and a half, something like that. And that actually led to, and over the course of that election also, I think they had one board member that was changed out with someone who was skeptical to someone who was very supportive. But the entire board got the message, and they voted, even though they didn't have to, they voted to move ahead with efforts to do pilot projects and get into the business. So I think we're going to see more of this. One of the things to keep in mind, I'll say, in defense of co-ops that don't want to do this, and Steve, you may have the stats on the tip of your tongue, but a lot of the electric co-ops have a manager who is in his 60s. Yes. And is probably going to be retiring soon. And this isn't just a matter of like not wanting to try something new. It's legitimately probably a bad decision to kick off a process like that when you're going to be out the door before it's finished. Right. So one of the things we see is most of the electric co-ops that move forward, they've often just had its transition and picked a manager who's well suited to this, who's going to be in it for the long haul.
Yeah, the other change that can occur, as you already mentioned, is in the governance. That you get, the board of directors as an electric co-op is just like a city council. They have to be elected by the membership, and you will have situations in which there is a bit of a change in the board, the members of the board, and they drive that decision to do something for the community when maybe the CEO is kind of tired and looking forward to retirement. So let's go to the next step.
Yeah, go ahead, Todd.
We had a question that was submitted about given the large footprints of the opportunity for backhaul agreements. That's really one of the things that we think that an organization like C-band can be good for, because as provider members join us and try to say what their plans are or what community members think their plans are, it's not where these networks are being built, it's where the next one's going to be built that can be of value, particularly where there's gaps in the backhaul. Yeah. And we heard that early on when we started C-band, that forward information sharing can actually help spur the next one because of backhaul partnerships and things that happen when somebody knows that somebody else may be making an investment in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. In North Carolina, we saw that actually, where there's a very aggressive telephone co-op, River Street Networks, which is actually just the competitive name for Wilkes, which built fiber out to their historic telephone territory and started expanding elsewhere and found opportunities across the state of North Carolina and into Virginia. And they actually came to an agreement with the electric cooperatives. So there's 26 in North Carolina, and they came to an agreement with the association of all of them to basically have access to backhaul, so they can go almost anywhere in North Carolina they want now at a very low cost by using the electric co-op fiber.
Right. And am I correct that that's what's happened in Colorado with a large number of municipals and co-ops that they ended up putting together a backhaul?
Oh, Project Thor. Yes,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, the Project Thor is similar. I mean, I think they built 400 miles for a few $1 million because they were able to reuse so much.
Yeah.
We mentioned before cooperation between RECs and maybe your independent telephone cooperatives. So the electric cooperatives and the telephone cooperatives, they don't always see eye to eye. There's some turfdom there. Have there been any good examples of collaboration between electric cooperatives and telephone cooperatives?
We're seeing some, not nearly as much as I wish we could see.
Mhm.
As I mentioned to you, I think before the program started, we had a situation in Indiana where the electric co-op and their neighboring telco merged, and they formed a new entity called Nine Star. And many of us thought that was finally opening the lid and making this possible. Unfortunately, that has not worked that well, and that looks like that might actually unwind.
Mm.
It's an odd dynamic that occurs. What seems like would make all the sense in the world. Part of it is fiefdom. I've got a board over here and a board over here, and if we do something together, then it's not going to be that big of a board. That's an issue. And there's sometimes just inertia.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're already busy. We've got plenty to do. We don't need to do that too.
Yeah, I think there's also the possibility of the electric co-op buying out the telephone co-op.
Yeah,
Often the telephone
yeah.
co-op is smaller and surrounded entirely by the electric co-op.
Yeah.
And so there's a question of just how much sense it makes for the telephone co-op to continue doing that. And that will depend depending on the management, on how well they've done over the years and things like that.
Yeah.
So there's I don't want to, again, this is going to be disrespectful to telephone co-ops, I think, but the electric co-ops, because of the way they were built and not subsidized over the years, they are among the most lean and mean, efficient economic engines. And there's still plenty that have made mistakes. And I don't want to say like they're all perfect, because they're not, but the telephone co-ops have had a history of operating expense, of operating subsidies, and that just leads to a different culture. And so there's just a different sense. And I think where they come into conflict, we've mostly seen the electric win. And also the electric is going to be having brand new infrastructure, while the telephone has years of legacies services to deal with. So, it's not necessarily a fair fight, but I think in many cases where they come together, the edge will be on the side of the electric if there is a conflict and competition.
Well, and you make a very good point. I mean, the telcos have a lot of copper wire hanging on poles and laying in the ground, and it works, but it's not gigabit, it's not gigahertz, it's not gigabit, it's megabit, but it's there and it works. And the justification for digging that up and putting in higher speed broadband or extending it beyond their existing reach, that economics are kind of interesting.
Do you think there are fewer barriers for collaboration and partnerships between RECs and municipalities perhaps than there are between RECs and telephone cooperatives?
Boy, it depends on what state you're in. And I tell you where the rub comes is service area.
Yeah.
Munis, it's been notorious, for example, in Minnesota and South Carolina, where they're basically at war with each other over service area, because the city can annex, and they'll annex service territory, and then they'll fight over what do they pay for the poles and wires that they've annexed. In other states, you don't have that conflict. They work together very well. All politics is local, and co-op and muni and telephone co-op politics are local.
Yeah, and I should say I talked more about where they compete, but we are seeing telephone co-ops working with electric ones. On muninetworks.org, we've talked about it in a number of cases. If you look under the cooperative tag, I think you'll come across those stories. I'm not immediately remembering those where the electric may be building the fiber and then leasing it on a long-term agreement to the telephone to operate. But we've also seen in Tennessee where an electric bought a telephone private company, or brought like 60% of the shares or something like that, to then have it as a partner that it more or less controlled. So I think, we'll see that again.
Middle Tennessee Electric Co-op just acquired United Telecommunications, and it's a marriage. It's the way it ought to work everywhere. And hopefully maybe that, there's going to be a lot of presentations at conferences about that, and hopefully that will catch fire.
You mean when we get to have conferences again, right?
Yeah. Well, we'll have them like this.
I guess we'll have them like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
I did want to bring up a point from one of our attendees that I think is an important one to remember. Dave adds, you need to separate the tier 3 telephone companies from the tier 1 and 2. Most of the tier 3s, even though they are the highest cost due to rural areas, are the most up to date in terms of fiber in the ground. The tier 1 and 2 companies are the most behind. Maybe just to explain to people that may not understand, tier 3 would be smallest companies. Tier 1 would be like Verizon, AT&T, big telephone companies, CenturyLink, that sort of thing. And tier 2 is kind of the ones in the middle. So that's a really good point. A lot of those rural telephone cooperatives, the tier 3, so to speak, have been using the subsidization they've received to pour back an investment in the network. So it's
Yeah,
one of the reasons why you have more fiber to the farm in America in many cases than you fiber to the house in town.
Right. We've been working on trying to get the research, and there's many hundreds to 1,000 independent telephone companies that would probably fall in that tier 3 who have done a really good job. In fact, in rural areas, I believe about 30% of the fiber to the home in rural areas is due to the cooperatives.
Yep.
Now, as I've said, I think that's going to be, that proportion is going to be changing significantly as the electrics get into it.
Right.
But the rural independent telephone companies have done a tremendous job. And the only reason we think about rural broadband as having a problem in many cases is because of the tier 1 and 2s that have done nothing. Yeah. The big AT&Ts, CenturyLink, they've just, Frontier's the worst. And so it's really important. I appreciate that comment, not to lump them all together.
Yeah.
Well, the investor owns, they're doing this for a return on investment for shareholders.
Right.
And that's a competitive thing. And they, you serving in those rural areas, you're not going to earn that kind of return. So why even go there? It's the reason that the Rural Electrification Act was passed in the 1930s. The IOUs were serving the cities and not the country.
Right.
Yeah, and the only reason we even got service in the entire cities is because of the munis. Originally, the IOUs only wanted to do the industrial centers.
Exactly. Yep, that's right. Well, what piece of advice would you have for somebody who's, say, watching the webinar and is trying to advance better broadband in their community? Let's say it's a small town. Would it behoove them to sit down and have a conversation with the REC nearby to see if there's some partnership opportunities there, or what advice would you give those folks?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things, we only have a couple minutes left, I won't go on forever about this, but one of the things to do is to make sure people understand we can solve this problem. A lot of my work has just been trying to demonstrate to people, if we can get fiber to 80% of the rural areas of North Dakota, you have better broadband in Western North Dakota if you throw a dart at a map than you do in the cities of North Dakota. In fact, than you do in any city in the United States, frankly. People need to understand that we can solve this. One of the problems we have is people think it's just not something we can do in rural America. Yeah. It frankly isn't even that expensive compared to the value we're going to get out of it. So the first thing is make sure people know you can do it. The second thing is make sure your local leaders are prioritizing it. And I think that's important because if you, Joe Schmo, want to have a meeting with a nearby electric cooperative, it's not going to be as useful as if you can get the city administrator, the town manager, the mayor, someone on city council to say, yes, this is a priority for us. We want to figure out how to make it easy on you or partner.
Yeah. Good point. I agree completely with Christopher. You go to the avenue that you have, and that's to go, if you're the city, you go to the city government. If it's the cooperative, you go to the board and say, we want to do this. And many times, unfortunately, the dynamics in a co-op, as you mentioned, the older general managers who are at rest in their executive position may not be as ambitious as when a customer comes to a board member. I mean, I remember being a senior vice president of an electric co-op, and when a board member got exercised about something, we paid attention.
Yeah, let me say that I think the next thing you'll hear if you go to the board is often, well, I don't really know much about this. A friend of mine's on a board of a big co-op here in Minnesota, and she, we had lunch and we were talking about other things, and it just came up, and I was like, oh yeah, there's all this stuff happening. She had never heard about it. And then there was one board member who had, but the first thing you may hear from the board member is, well, who else is doing it, and what's the experience been? That's what I try to do, is collect those stories so you can say, here's interviews with people who have already done it, or here's news articles about those who have done it already.
Yeah, in my experience, back in the days of load management and all the different kinds of things that have happened, technology and operations wise, to get an electric cooperative to do something, you get them on a bus and you go to an electric cooperative that's doing it. And when those board members talk to the board members where it's working, they go back with a whole new view of the world. It's a show and tell kind of environment.
Yeah, and especially because it used to be that you didn't have good broadband for 200 miles from your home if you're in a rural area,
Right.
perhaps. Now you might have it 30 miles away. People will move on the
Yeah.
basis of this,
Yes.
you know, and if
Yes.
they don't move their home, they may just move their business center. You know, they might rent a space in a town or another place and drive there as an office rather than working from home. So
Yeah.
it's going to be a significant drain for areas that don't have it as the areas around them fill in.
I will say too, though, as people are going to approach their policymakers, that they have to also have more than just anecdotal evidence. They need that, you know, talk to the economic development people about how many prospects they're not getting, and how does that translate to a little bit of load growth,
Yes.
and how does that translate to the trend of the utility of what's going on in that area, because it's very much a numbers-driven business on both ends.
Yeah.
Electricity is much more numbers driven than what people think it is. And those are typically who rose to the top ranks in electric utilities are good with the numbers and the engineering. And so they want to see the evidence. And it's not just, I think back in the day when it was just my Netflix is slow, but that was not quite the demand reason. Where now I think if you can paint that broader picture of trends and business case of the value is there for the electric utility, I think that's part of the equation that has been the barrier.
Yeah.
You know, I think that we're going to find this out hopefully at some time in the near future, but it's my belief that there are a whole lot of people that learned to work from home during COVID that will never go back to an office.
Never go back.
And they're
get
going
their doctor's appointment at home.
Absolutely.
My daughters, I have one daughter with some medical issues. It's all online. It's so convenient. I think you're right. We've turned a corner that we will never go back.
Just a quick story. I've been trying to get an allergy shot, which I can't do remotely, and to get the series started. And I could have had 3 video chats. I've been trying to get a physical appointment, and the health company is just pushing me video for everything. So I think that it took a while, but that's not changing back. They're going to stay with that.
Yes.
There will be a day when the doctor will send the plans for a syringe to your 3D printer in your home and ship you the vial of the actual medicine and say, here's how to do it. Go
to this neighborhood location where a registered nurse will do it for you.
Yep.
You know, one of the things that I just saw, so I'm part of a major medical group here, and they're closing a location, and they just shut it down like that because they need to cut costs, and they're realizing that they have too many physical locations now. And so they're not going to be able to go back.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yes, and Walgreens are already looking to fill that void at the neighborhood level in their plans, and apparently that's going to be integrating telemedicine somehow and more data sharing.
This virus is going to end up serving as an amazing technological accelerant for so many trends in this country that are right on the precipice and, are going to take off. Hopefully some of those are also good trends, not just technology, but hopefully people will learn to be kinder to one another and things like that. But we'll just have to wait and see.
One of the things we're going to have to figure out what to do. I get Amazon Prime is at my door every day of the week. We got to do something with all that cardboard.
Yep.
Seriously.
Cities are going to have to start giving you 2 recycling bins because I'm the same way. If breaking down the cardboard is a major part of my Sunday afternoon.
Yes.
Well, we're gonna go ahead and end our webinar now. No unanswered questions. I do want to again bring up this slide to talk about our next C-band Lunch and Learn. We're really excited to have our Congressman Cindy Axne, a Democrat from Iowa, who was involved in the creation of the Accessible Affordable Internet for All Act, which has been passed out of the House and on its way to the Senate for consideration. So we'll talk with Representative Axne about how the bill evolved, what's in it, what's not in it, what its chances might be to actually become law. We invite everybody to register. I made a little short URL here for you to register if you would like. You can see it here at the bottom of your screen, and we'll also be sending an email out to everybody that's on the webinar today with the link and also some follow-up information, and it'll be sent to our C-band membership as well. So everybody, we hope you'll join us for that. And once again, thank you to our panelists, Steve Collier and Christopher Mitchell. Thank you, gentlemen, for your wisdom and insight. And to Todd, thank you for, well, your wisdom and insight. I have so little, I have to distribute it and grab it from other people. So thank you, everybody, for joining us here on C-band Lunch and Learn. We'll see you next time.